done this too many of these things to not have notes that I can fall back on when I get nervous. We have three families that we may talk about today. The first family and the oldest family, the earliest family to come here was the Kerr family. And then the next family to come along and to get tangled up with the Kerrs was the Woodward family. And finally, to come right after 1900, we have the Stenbergs, Mr. Stenberg. So that's who the families that we'll be talking about today. And Mike's going to hold up a piece of paper that lists the 6 Kerr boys. There were 6 Kerr boys in the family and 2 girls in the family. And their mother was Ellen Micklejohn Kerr, and she was born in Fifeshire, Scotland, and they emigrated to, as far as I know, Campbelford, Canada, when she was 15 years old. So then she married in Campbelford and raised her family there until she came to California. So the question is, who were the Kerrs and why am I talking about them? And the answer is, they were some of the early people that came to the coast. The first that we hear about the Kerrs is in 1881. William Kerr was buried at Manchester Cemetery, and he turns out to be the oldest of the children. He was born in 1850. He was driving the stage from Point Arena north, and when he got to the Garcia River, it was flooded, and so he decided that he would get the mail through, and he swam the river with the mail and contracted pneumonia and died. So he's the first one to stay on the coast of the brothers. Then probably we hear about, probably they came between 1879 and 1880 if he already had a job as a stage driver by 1881. The next time we hear about him in 1887, and Sam and Robert and Dave are working in the area, and a brother named John, who was younger, one of the younger ones, had already left and gone back east. James is the only one that didn't bother to come to the West Coast until 1900. Actually, all of them died in California except one. After coming from Canada and immigrating and all those years, they all ended up in California. Robert is the one brother, and I may call him Bob because I always heard him called Uncle Bob. Robert is the one who spent his life on the coast. He worked and operated bars and hotels and livery stables, and he was slightly crippled according to what I know, but I never was told how he was crippled. He had to have had a limp because he couldn't have tended bar or anything like that if he wasn't adequate in his hands. So, but he liked to hunt, and we have several pictures of him hunting, and one of the pictures we have of him is with Life Ball, who was another barman at Albion, if some of you know that name. My aunt would always say something about Life Ball. I really think she had a case on him because the way she talked about him. So then in 1887, at that time, his mother, Ellen Micklejohn, and Euphemia, the youngest daughter, came to the coast. They came across the country by train and landed in San Francisco. But there's some other things I have to tell you about that family before we get that far. My grandmother was born, I should say, the Micklejohns weren't any better than anybody else, and the Kerrs either. My grandmother was born a year and a half after Mr. Kerr died. And the Micklejohn family, they were weavers, and they were they did not really appreciate the fact that this child was born out of wedlock, and they treated her that way. I don't know that they treated her mother that way, but they treated her, I always said she was Cinderella without a fairy godmother, because she got to clean the shop where they sold their weaving and to keep the house and do things like that. And her life for her was nothing but really hard work. And she was really glad by the time she was 18 to have enough money to get out of there and to come to California. I'm sure she didn't earn all the money that brought her to California. I'm sure the brothers helped to pay for that. So when they landed in when the mother and daughter landed in San Francisco, they were met by one of the brothers, and I suspect it was the brother Dave, and a guy named Al Woodward. And Al Woodward, his whole name was John Alexander Woodward. He was an Irishman, and he had come to California in 1884, and he'd worked a while in Petaluma, and then he worked in the Navarro Woods, and finally ended up at Whitesboro and got acquainted with the Kerr Boys. So this was the group that came on the boat to Cuffey's Cove on a ship from San Francisco to Cuffey's Cove. And then eventually they got to Whitesboro. And one thing that's interesting to me that I didn't know was Whitesboro was part of Cuffey's Cove Township. And we'll find out about that. Now there was another sister in the family too. There are always people, lots of people. And her name was Isabel, only they called her Belle. And I don't know for sure whether she came with them, I was never told. So when she came, she was mentioned later and not in the paper at the time that I first encountered them. She married Fred Barton, a brother to Homer Barton, and Fred worked as a tallyman at Albion for a long time, and then eventually they moved to Scotia and lived in Eureka, and they had 3 children, and the only one that we really know much about, 2 of them ended up in the state of Maine, but Martha Barton went with her parents to Eureka. She was apparently younger than the other children, and she worked in dailies for years, and when we'd go up to Institute, my Aunt Grace Woodward would go and visit Martha Barton in the daily store. The Bartons are actually in one of the pictures back there of the Southside Hotel. Now, Grandma Kerr owned a house in Fort Bragg, and it was a house that's still there. Jeanette owns the house today. It's at the corner of Laurel and McPherson Street on the southeast corner. And she and my grandmother lived in that house when they first came to Fort Bragg, landed and came to Fort Bragg. And I'll get this straight. My grandmother, Euphemia Kerr, worked for the Wellers, H.A. Weller, Horace Weller, and they were, he owned a store in Fort Bragg, and he was quite successful in his store. But there was another thing about the Wellers that figures into my family. He was a staunch supporter of the Sunday School Union, and he helped to start the First Baptist Church. So after my grandmother worked for them for a while, she joined the First Baptist Church in Fort Bragg and was a lifelong member. Now I would wonder, when her mother was buried, she was buried in the service by a Presbyterian minister, so she was holding on to her Scotch Presbyterianism, but I think my grandmother might have had more reason than just because the Wellers influenced her not to belong to the Presbyterian Church, but to join the Baptist Church and be on a different plane. Well, 2 of the brothers, Dave and Sam, never married while they were around on the coast here. So they'd work a season in the woods, and when the woods closed down in the winter, they'd take off and travel or go stay with their relatives. And so they never really settled down here. They traveled off hither, thither, and yon, and finally both of them settled on being in the mining industry. And Dave was in Idaho, and Sam was in Republic, Washington, in the mining industry. Well, we go back to Robert now. Robert worked at the Navarro Ridge Hotel. It's the picture on the top of the screen back there. At the very top in the middle is the Navarro Ridge Hotel.
Far left.
Yeah, I'm pointing at it right now. Okay. So he worked at that hotel, and it was probably owned by Frank Severance at that time. And that building today is Fencelton Inn. So, and he worked there for about 5 years, and in that time, because that area was part of the Cuffey Code Township, he not only was the constable, but he was eventually appointed the deputy sheriff for the township. Then finally there came some kind of legal action between my great-grandmother Ethel Kerr and Mr. Severance. And I don't know, it continued for quite a while, and I never found any settlement of it. But about that time that legal action came up, Bob left that place, left Mr. Severance's employ, and we find him just a little while later opening a bar and hotel in Whitesboro in 1896. And the little picture to the side of that, you probably looked at pictures of Whitesboro a lot of times and seen that there were a couple of hotels in Whitesboro. So he had one of the hotels in Whitesboro. One of the things that he enjoyed doing as a hotel keeper was give dances, which he called balls. And at one time in 1896, he engaged a Professor Earlston to do a balloon ascension and a parachute jump. That was in April. Then in July, we heard last 2 weeks ago, or down at when we were at the Whitesboro Grange, and they were talking about the Navarro. That the same Professor Earlston on 4th of July did the same demonstration down at Navarro. So they continued in business there until Mr. White took his mill and his operations down to Greenwood. And then they had to close that hotel down in 1899 and move on. Then you find him. He's going to move to another hotel. You know good and well that that's his business. So now he opens two of them have names. Albion Ridge Hotel, the one that was on the picture that was on the flyer. And at that hotel, as soon as they got there and got settled, he and Mr. Cooper, they had a ball. And they also made some improvements to the place. Would you believe it or not, a watering trough was an improvement, as well as gas lights for the establishment. And in that picture, the lady that's standing on the extreme right of the upstairs porch is my great-grandmother, Ellen Kerr. So we know she was there because there's some pictures there. Okay, and most of the time, from the time my grandmother married and didn't need anybody to chaperone her anymore, Grandma Kerr lived with Robert at whatever hotel that he operated. So from now on, she's gonna be living with him most of the time. One of the things that happened, you want to tell about the baseball?
Sure.
Okay, he's going to tell you about an event that took place at the hotel.
Now in
It's 99.
it doesn't say the year here, but in December of that year, the Fort Bragg baseball team came down to play Albion. And they must have been pretty rambunctious because they got there at 11:30 in the morning and promptly were escorted to the Kerrs Hotel and were entertained there until game time at 3 o'clock. And Albion must not have had a very good team because Fort Bragg won the game 11-0, and afterward there was a banquet and dance to honor the team, with the Kerrs being one of the treaters of this. And the editor of the Fort Bragg Advocate visits the hotel and promotes it in his paper, and he always writes very positively about Robert Kerr and his undertakings here on the coast.
Well, in February of 1903, Robert visits Charlie Cavanaugh, the editor of the Fort Bragg Advocate, and tells him that he's going to start, that he's bought the Hillgard Hotel on the flat at Albion, and that he's going to remodel it and make a hotel out of that building. Now, Charlie, the reason I think Charlie Cavanaugh is so friendly towards Robert is because he was Charlie would have been a kid probably when Robert came and got acquainted with him, but they were, all his life he was, in the paper he was always positive. I'll read a couple of his remarks as we go along. So they immediately get the hotel organized and set up, and in Louis Huff's book, there's a description of what the hotel was decorated like. It says that it was decorated with tinted burlap, with wainscoting of paper mache matrices from the SF Bulletin. Now, if any of you know, do you know what matrices were? They were a sheet about this big, the size of a newspaper page, and they were pressed with the design, and they poured the lead in it, and then that was what they printed from. So we bought a house in Oakland that had been a summer house for somebody even before the 1906 earthquake, and it had single 2x4s with matrices on both sides of it for the wall in that house. So they weren't kidding about what it was. So let's see. The other things that they did to the hotel, they had electric lights in that hotel, and tried to really make it a classy place.
Was this the Albion South?
What?
Was this the Albion South, that one? Or
It was down on the flat, right across from the mill site.
And was it called the Albion South?
It was called the Southside Hotel.
Southside.
Southside Hotel, yeah. You have to tell me when I don't tell you everything, because I forget what I'm talking about. And don't feel bad about interrupting me, because you look at this too. This was where everybody knew Grandma Kerr, and everybody called her Grandma. And she must have been a real friendly, sociable person. Either that, or she was so dignified she impressed them that they wouldn't treat her any other way. But she got postcards from up and down the coast and from over everywhere else. Anybody that came seemed like would write her a postcard, because that was the era that postcards were popular. And back on the table are some postcards that are addressed to, some to Mrs. Kerr and some to Grandma Kerr. And there's one there even that my grandmother wrote to her mother on a postcard, and gave her a whole message on the postcard. So.
The Woodward girls.
Hmm?
The Woodward girls.
Oh, no. I'm not going to change that. I changed that. In 1903, the same year that they started that he started the hotel, the brother Jim, who had lived in Michigan, came to California and spent a little time out here and decided that his arthritis was much better in the wintertime in California than it was in Michigan. So he moved, within the year, he moved to California and he bought a bar in Casper. And he had a bar there for a year or two in Casper. And he had a daughter who was, as a child, had a dislocated hip. And they didn't know what to do about the dislocated hip. And so she ended up being wheelchair bound all of her life. But she was one of those people who made the best of what she had, and she always had a good attitude, and they owned a house in Pleasanton and a theater in Pleasanton, and she, in the 30s, I remember, and she sold the tickets, and her husband, Charlie, ran the movies, but she had a house built for her that she could do the housework in, and she was very proud of the fact that she could take care of herself. So that was Jim's daughter, Ethel, and there's a picture of her back there too, with her dad. Okay, do you want to do the sodium? Or shall I do the sodium? Okay. From April on, the lumber company, from April of 1904 on through the year through December, the lumber company was building a ship called the Sodioma, just up the river from the Southside Hotel. And this ship was a very interesting ship. They had a lot of dreams about what the ship was going to do, but the design of the ship shot it down before they got anywhere with it. It was quite a good sized ship, 100, I've got two different figures on how long it was, but it was probably around 130, I get 170 and 140 feet long, and it was about 36 foot beam, and its hold was 10 feet 6 inches, but it was built like a barge. It had a flat bottom, and that meant that you could load lots of stuff in it, but it also meant that it was going to go like a sled when you tried to move it. It had 3 masts to help it sail, but it was not a great sailor. It cost them $25,000 to build the ship. And of course, the day that they launched it, on December 6th of 1904, there was a big party at the Southside Hotel. And it said, the paper said that the hotel was tested to its fullest on that day. See, I want to read a quote. It says, "The Southside Hotel, conducted by genial Joe Rushing and affable Robert Kerr, catered to the tired, the hungry, and the thirsty with a bountiful supply of the best the market affords on the south side of the Albion River." And that isn't from Mr. Kavanaugh, that was from the Beacon that they said that. Okay, so after the big party and the launch, and I'm willing to bet that the 3 Woodward girls that you haven't heard about yet were there that day working to take care of the waitressing part of the business, because all of them in their lifetime did work as waitresses at the hotel. So after the launch of the ship, they were supposed to put lumber on it there at the mill. Then they were supposed to take the drawbridge up where the cars came across the river and take it down and fill it with the rest of the lumber at the wharf. There was one problem. The drawbridge cables had been left down so long that they didn't work anymore. And it took them another month to get the cables on the drawbridge fixed so that the ship could be moved out to the wharf and loaded. And then they towed it to San Francisco, of course, loaded with lumber. And then after they unloaded it, they installed the 2 engines in it, the gas engines in it that were going to move it. And its life was 28 5/10 months. And yet it made money for them even at that short a life. It burned outside of Humboldt Bay Harbor, the entrance to Humboldt Bay, just 28 months after it was built. Okay, in 1905, Joe Rushing, he was Bob's partner in this hotel, but they had also known each other in Whitesboro. Joe had managed the store for White at Whitesboro. So they were really familiar, and actually our family was always connected. And you know what? Down at the Little River Cemetery, the Kerr stone is here, and right next to it is the Rushing stone. See, there are two plots right there together. Anyway, he left and took the opportunity to run the Windsor Hotel in Fort Bragg, and did a good job of it, but didn't live too long to enjoy the fruits of his labors, unfortunately. And as soon as he left, then Jim, the brother that owned the bar in Casper, immediately sold that bar and came to work to join his brother in the Southside Hotel. So then it was Kerr and Kerr running the hotel. But 2 years later, they split the business, and Jim takes the livery stable and Bob keeps the hotel. And Jim is the kind of person who goes from one business to another business to another business. It made me tired following that story of how many businesses he engaged in over a period of maybe 30 years that I read about him. Okay. At this time, in about 1907 and 8, Robert begins to have heart trouble, and so he's doctoring for that. But there is an incident that happens in 1908, and Mike's going to tell you about one of the murder stories that we have.
It's the headline from the Mendocino Beacon, June 20th, 1908. Jack Keener shot and killed. Railroad engineer shot by section boss. Jack Keener, a locomotive engineer on the Northwestern Pacific Railroad running out of Albion, was shot and killed at the Southside Hotel, Albion, Tuesday by J.L. Reed, a railroad section boss, and both men were duly sober. According to the testimony admitted at the coroner's inquest held here Thursday, that would be in Mendocino, an altercation had taken place between the men during the morning of the day of the shooting over remarks alleged to have been made by Reed concerning a dining room girl named Annie Gunner. Now, Reed's face bore evidence of the fact that he had received considerable punishment during the encounter. Reed had come to Mendocino and swore out a warrant for Keener's arrest. The warrant was placed in Constable Curtis's hands, but the officer had not served the warrant at the time of the shooting. Reed returned to Albion and had supper at the Southside Hotel. He was warned in the dining room not to return to the bar room as there would be trouble. He said he would not go in as he did not want any more trouble. Tony Lundberger, Keener's fireman, started into the dining room to see Reed, just as the latter had closed the dining room door and stood on the steps. Reed ordered Lundberger in a menacing manner to come no further, and the latter retired. Then it was that Keener appeared on the scene. The fatal shot was fired from the steps in the little hallway, the ball striking Keener high up on the right breast, and the bullet ranged downward. He fell and expired at once. As to what was said by the men at the time was developed at the inquest. One of the girls was in the side hallway and saw the flash of the pistol. The verdict of the coroner's jury, boiled down, was that Jack Keener was born in Pennsylvania about 24 years came to his death June 16th from a gunshot wound, presumably by the hand of J.L. Reed, who, in our opinion, was justified in doing so. Signed, W.T. Wallace, Jr., Foreman, Charles M. Buck, E.P. Rasmussen, W.H. Brown, W.T. Wallace, J.M. Garvin, E. Bailey, J.A. Boyd, and Ralph Bryans. Deputy District Attorney Jenkins represented the interests of the people, and Attorney Pearsall of Fort Bragg appeared for Reed. Reed's preliminary examination will be held tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Reed is bound over for Superior Court. This is the headline in the Mendocino Beacon on June 27th, the following week in 1908. The preliminary hearing of J.L. Reed here last Saturday on a felony charge before Judge Murray created an unusual amount of interest owing to the large number of friends on both sides. County Court Reporter Eddie of Ukiah was on hand to take the testimony of the numerous witnesses. Reed was bound over to appear before Superior Court. The charge read, J.L. Reed did willfully, wrongfully, and with malice aforethought shoot, kill, and murder with a revolver one Jack Keener, a human being. The evidence did not show that Keener, the man killed, had made any threats against the life of the defendant. The only threat made by him was when in the bar room of the Southside Hotel, he asked for Reed and was told he was out. When Keener said, "It's a good thing he is not here or I would give him worse." It is claimed the evidence proved that the only intention of the deceased was to get the defendant into the bar room and there in the presence of witnesses make him prove statements alleged to have been previously made by him concerning Anna Gunner. The fact was established that the dead man had no weapon on him when found. The defense showed that numerous threats had been made by some of the friends of Keener after the latter had smashed Reed's face, and that they were of such a nature that Reed verily believed his life to be in imminent danger. The witnesses called to testify at the examination were, for the prosecution, Tony Nunberger, Anna Gunner, Cora Lindsay, she was the girl who saw the muzzle flash, Marshall McElroy, Robert Kerr, Barney Orr, Dr. Thorpe, Charles Troutman, William Fisher, W.H. Jarvis, and J.J. DeWoodley. Witnesses for the defendant also included Anna Gunner, Cora Lindsay, Robert Kerr, J.M. Kerr, and Fred Barton, also a relative, Al Peterson, F. Severance, T.E. McGlepsey, T. Tinkenpaw, John Russell, Mrs. Fred Barton, Leslie Robinson, and Stephen Spillman. And as far as the actual outcome of this, more research needs to be done.
We did not determine how he was sentenced. So. Okay, so in 1910, early in 1910, Bob Kerr goes to San Francisco because he really is critically ill, and he doesn't make it. He dies in March of 1910, and is brought back to Albion, and they have a big funeral for him, and then he's buried in Little River Cemetery, as I said. His mother took that death really hard. She never really was as good after that as she had been before. Her brother Jim settled the estate and took over running the Southside Hotel and took over the responsibility for his mother. For a while, he also ran the Albion Hotel on the other side of the river, and then eventually leased that one out and just ran the Southside Hotel. Finally, he decides that he'll sell the Southside Hotel And he and his mother move into a house. And just a few months later, he buys a bar in Ukiah, the Rich Lou Bar. And he takes his mother off to Ukiah with him. So Ellen by this time is getting to be in her middle 80s. And over in Ukiah, maybe it's the hot weather, I don't know. Anyway, she didn't feel well over there, and she asked to come back to Fort Bragg, to the coast. And so she came to live with the Woodwards at their home. And all of the family, all of my mother's family, because it was my grandmother that she came to live with, all of them were really pleased that she was there for a while, and they felt honored that they were able to take care of her in the last few months of her life. And she died in 1916. She'd lived on the coast for 35 years, and she'd lived most of that time in Albion. And with that much of the story, we're going to stop the Kerrs and go on to the Woodwards. But does anybody have any questions right now before we go on to the Kerrs? Have we snowed you with a lot of names and information?
Where exactly was Whitesboro?
Say that again.
Where exactly was it? Was it Navarro Ridge?
Santa Creek.
Santa Creek.
Yeah, Whitesboro is Salmon Creek,
Okay.
right. Okay, so now we're going to go back in time to the day in November of 1888 when Euphemia Kerr married John Alexander Woodward. They were married by Reverend Ross at his home in Casper, and the first job, that Al was able to get, I'm going to call my grandfather Al all the time, his grandpa Al. The first job he was able to get was in Glen Blair. And so they moved to Glen Blair, and and Grandpa Al actually worked with his brother-in-law, Dave Kerr, at least 1 or 2 seasons in Glen Blair. And there is a picture of them standing up on the springboards on a tree back there on the board. So you'll have to look at that and you can see what Grandpa Al looked
They were
like.
timber fallers.
Yeah, well, at least that's what it looks like. Those are posed pictures, so don't make any statements about what their actual job was. So, in the time that they lived at Glen Blair, their three daughters were born. Flossie, who was Flossie Dornan of Dornan's Hardware, and Hazel Kaufman Wood Stanley, my mother, and Myrtle Woodward LaValle, who worked in the telephone office for a long time. So they left there at the time of the Depression, in the time of the 1893 Depression. I don't think the Fort Bragg mill closed, but the Glen Blair mill did close down completely. And they left there and moved to town briefly. And then my grandfather was able to rent a place called the Cooper Place at Kaibasilla. So they moved to Kaibasilla, and they lived in Kaibasilla until 1900. They lived in Kaibasilla. And my grandfather in Ireland, his family were farmers, so he was perfectly comfortable to go to being a farmer. And while they lived at Kaibasilla, 2 more children were born, the boys. Roy was the older, Russell was the younger. There's one story, and this story won me a typewriter. I don't think it's a great story, but the results were good.
How old you were?
Oh, I was in junior high when this happened. My mother, when she was between 4 and 5 years old, and she was probably 5 years old when this happened. She wandered away from the house and went down and wanted to see Papa. And so she went down to the field, and Papa was mowing the hay with a mower, the mower that when as the wheels turn, the cutters go like this. It's a wicked looking thing. And she's out there in the field, and the hay is taller than my mother. And my grandfather doesn't see her. And the horses stop, and my grandfather tries to make the horses go, and the horses won't go. They just stand there. And I don't really know whether my mother said something that my grandfather heard or whether he got off of the mower and went and found her. But the horses were smarter than Grandpa then. And I enjoyed the use of my typewriter for a while. The girls actually started to school in Campbelford, and I have one offshoot of this that I'd love to tell. The teacher that they had at Campbelford was Miss St. Ors, S-T-N-O-R-E-S. And you know where Miss St. Ors came from? She came from down the coast, where that fancy Russian building is now, that they all think it was a Russian thing that got the name St. Ors, but it wasn't. It was just this family that lived on that property. Okay. And if she hadn't had that teacher, I would never have known that. In 1900, they had to move from the property at Caivasilla, and they spent a brief time in a terrible old house called the Stewart Place on the south side of Seaside. You know, Seaside, I don't know if any of you remember, there was a crummy old house up there on the south side of Seaside long ago. I can remember seeing it when I was a kid. The house leaked.
North of 10 Mile, it's the beach just north of 10 Mile Beach.
Right, right.
Or
And-
10 Mile River, pardon me.
Yeah, 10 miles. Anyway, the house leaked. Grandpa was away in the wintertime working someplace else, and there wasn't enough for them to eat. They got mussels off the rock and did anything they could to have enough to eat at that particular time. So they were all really glad when less than a year later, he managed to buy another piece of property, the Ware property at Inglenook this time. We're moving down the coast. Moved to Inglenook. Well, Inglenook had its own stories, and you probably all heard the story about the post office there, that it was on skids, and that when there was a Democratic regime in office, the Democrat got to be the postmaster, and when it was a Republican in office, the Republican got to be the postmaster, and they were on opposite sides of the street, so that the post office moved back and forth. Roy and Russell about that time were old enough to go to school, and they had gotten a pony cart. They had a pony and a cart, and they used to watch the Barnard stage guy drive up full tilt and stop right in front of the post office. So they decided they'd try it. And of course, you know, the inevitable result was that they ran into the post office and they were all tangled up in the, and my aunt would just laugh so hard when she told that story on them, because she could remember how it looked. And there's a picture of the post office back there on the. So, about 1903, a deal to build a mill and to harvest the timber that was on that property fell through, so Grandpa sold that place. And they moved to the Company Ranch. Everybody know what I mean by the Company Ranch on the Noyo and on the California Western line. And of course, after having lived in the Stewart place and then at the Ware place, they were really happy. That was a beautiful place to live, and they went to school for a while out there, and everybody had really positive feelings about having lived at the Company Ranch for a while. But that was when Grandpa finally did the thing that was really important. He bought the Isaac Campy property south of Fort Bragg in what was called Noyo. Today, that street that property was on is Cypress Street, and it was the Bolden Dairy. If any of you remember the Bolden Dairy. Okay, so today that's a street that goes clear down almost to the end of the hill at Noyo. In those days it stopped right there about where Parents and Friends property ends. There was a gate across there, and every morning and every night the cows walked up from the river to be milked there, because the Woodward family had a dairy, and they delivered milk, and they had a slaughterhouse, and they also had a meat wagon at one time. They also raised wonderful potatoes, and they sold those as a crop, and they raised beans. And
The property actually ran all the way down the truck road to the Noyo River. That was all encompassed in that ranch, and they lived there for 34 years.
yeah, they lived there a long. That was after all the moving around. That was the anchor, was that ranch. By this time, the girls were old enough to be in high school or to be out working, and Flossie was the neat one, the clean one, who worked in the kitchen, you know. My mother was the one who went out and helped in the barn, and she milked cows. And she tried high school, but she couldn't stand, she said, I had to wipe common her off my shoes as I walked up to school, and I smelled like the cow barn, and I couldn't stand that, so she quit high school and didn't finish. Instead, my mother got the opportunity to train at the German hospital in San Francisco. And so she'd spent pretty much most of her training at the hospital when she met a detourer. And the detourer was a jockey named Caldwell. And she ran off with him to Los Angeles. And of course, it ended disastrously. He deserted her. And so she had to endure the fact that for her indiscretion, she got her picture in the Hearst paper, you know, with the jockey's picture and her picture, and she had to read in her own newspaper at home sort of an article that was a defense of her, more or less, and a criticism of the guy, because it turns out he was a married man from Mendocino. And also the ignominious end of having her father go to San Francisco and bring her back. And the train, what's really interesting about the train ride is they took the train from Sausalito to either Willits or Sherwood. Then they got on a stage and went to Alpine, and then from Alpine they probably had to stay overnight, and then they came to Fort Bragg on the train, because this was in 1910. And the train did not go all the way through until about 1913, that you could go all the way to Willard. So, in the meantime, my Aunt Flossie had been working down at Albion, and she met a nice man at Albion that she decided she wanted to marry. And I think my mother was on the rebound, because by October of 1910, she and Flossie are having a double wedding at the ranch and Flossie is marrying Tom Dornan, and my mother is marrying Jean Kaufman. And guess who's going to do the service for them? Reverend Ross did the service for the two girls, just the same as he'd done for their parents, and he gave them a lovely sermon. They quoted it in the paper, so you could see that he gave them what for. Maybe he was thinking about my mother and how she'd acted. So anyway, now Tom worked for the Albion Lumber Company, and he was a baseball player. And he played baseball for Albion for a long time. And so Flossie and Tom went back to live down at Albion. And that would have been the hotel. This is 1910, so the hotel was still in operation then. And they were married in 10, and Tom Dornan Jr. was born in January of 1912. Hazel and Jean lived in Fort Bragg. He worked for the Union Lumber Company. There's a picture of him in our museum in 1911. He's part of the crew of the mill in 1911. So he was working in Fort Bragg. And their daughter was born in 1911. And her name was Lucille Elizabeth Kaufman. And she married Jack Logan, and maybe some of you bought a car from Mr. Logan sometime or other. Anyway, and of course she taught school in Fort Bragg in the junior high for a long time. In 1914, the old racetrack subdivision in Fort Bragg, that was south of Fort Bragg in the Noyo. It went, you know where Perco's is now at that motel. Well, east of that, about a street and a half, from there clear over to where you'd overlook Noyo, that was all the racetrack subdivision. It was a racetrack. And my grandfather, when it was foreclosed, my grandfather bought it. And so he and the Berry Hill Realty Company subdivided that into lots and into acre plots. And over time they sold it. But the interesting thing is that my mother bought lots there, and my aunt, the Dornans, bought lots there. And when the Dornans moved to town, to Fort Bragg in 1915, then they built a house there, and my parents built a house there. And that street now, at that time it was a no-name street because it didn't have an opening to South Street at all. It's now Woodward Avenue. And so when I was a little kid, we lived on a no-name street, but today it has a name. What?
The house is still there?
The house is still there.
Yeah. The Dornans' house is still there. Jane Randall lives in the Dornans' house. It's been remodeled a lot, and our house is the one across the street owned by the Bishops lived there. So, and some of that property that was in the subdivision, that subdivision ended up in the hospital property too. So in 1916, after the Dornans moved to town, we find that Tom Dornan is partners with Lee Pasola in a hardware store on Franklin Street. And Tom, the family owned that hardware store after the Pasolas moved out of it until they were in that particular building until the middle of probably 1942, and then they moved about 3 doors down the street to what's the Barrett Mall now, and that was the Dornan Hardware after that. So, the year now I already talked about Grandma Kerr, so you know that she passed away in 1916, and she was buried in Little River right beside Bob. And at that time, all the Kerr relatives, Sam and everybody was still alive, so everybody came to her funeral and had a get-together, and that was one of the last times they were all together. So, and that was the same year, 1916. My sister made the paper because a dog bit her on the cheek. and that was Rose property. You know where the new clinic is on South Street? Mm-hmm. Well, all the property ahead of that clinic, from there to the county road, was one great big field. And that was Rose Field. And when we'd go from our house to the ranch, we'd walk up around Rose and go on a stile over that long field and a stile on the other side, and then go back down to, it was from South Street to Cypress Street to go, when I went from my house in Noyo to my grandmother's house. And that great big field. One year in the 30s, a carnival came and stayed there, and they were there almost a year because there just wasn't any point in them moving on. I guess they couldn't make any money. I always remember, we thought it was great because we could go down to the carnival every night if we wanted. Okay, what do you want to talk about? Anything special? No. I've got one more murder to talk about. Shall I talk about the murder? Any questions at this point? Okay, while my mother was single before she married my father in 1921, she went with a couple of guys. One guy she went with liked to make pasta with lots of garlic in it, and would, every once in a while, she'd make up a mess of this garlic and pasta and eat it herself because nobody else was really that excited about the garlic and pasta. Then she had another fellow, too, and his name was Ed Bishop, and he was from Wisconsin and was quite a nice gentleman, not a ruffian. Actually, he was quite nice. He chose that doll that's sitting back there and gave that doll to my sister, and she named that doll Edna after him. My mother gave him a silver cigarette case with his initials on it. They had parted company long by the time that the murder took place, but Ed Bishop took his car and left he was working in the Albion Woods, and he left the camp at Albion and said he'd be back that night. And then the next day, somebody named Jack Carlisle came and said, well, Ed decided he was going to go to San Francisco and live, and he told me to come and get his stuff and hold it until he tells me where he is. So the boss of the camp didn't like that story, and so he eventually called the sheriff and told him about it. Well, the sheriff was sick, so he didn't do anything about it. But finally, Ward Reese got some information, and they suspected all along that it was Carlisle because he had the car, and he even admitted that he had forged a bill of sale for the car. So they had strong suspicions about him. But somebody called Ward Reese, the deputy sheriff in Fort Bragg, and said, from Windling, and said that Carlisle had been down there and had told somebody that Ed wasn't going to come back. That's what he told them. And they also told Ward Reese what pocket he had Ed Bishop's gun in. Those were two important pieces of information. So when Ward Reese went to arrest him on Franklin Street in Fort Bragg as he got in the car, the first thing Ward Reese did was remove the gun from his pocket. And of course, without any way to defend himself, he agreed to be arrested. The sheriff questioned him in Ukiah at least 2 different times over a couple of days, and he stuck to his story that Ed had gone to San Francisco. But Ward was a clever person, and he had a record of doing sneaky things to prisoners to get them to talk. And in this case, he lied that they had brought a body in on the speeder that day and that they hadn't identified it yet. And it made one other intimation, which I don't remember, but anyway, it broke Carlisle, and he confessed that he had killed Ed Bishop. And he tried to make it sound like Ed had shot at him and that he had shot Ed back. But he rented the gun that he shot Ed Bishop with from Horace Weller in the morning and brought the gun back to Horace Weller in the afternoon. So my mother didn't know, the stories in the paper don't say a whole lot more. My mother didn't know if he was necessarily in with drugs. That was what Carlisle intimated, that they had been involved in drugs. But for any reason, it certainly sounded like Carlisle just coveted what he had and shot him for it. So, of course, Carlisle did time for that. And now, Ed Bishop's buried out in the Fort Bragg Cemetery, and of course there's no marker. I'm sure we drive over old Ed every time we drive around in the Catholic part of the cemetery. Okay, yeah.
I can remember Ward Reese was a deputy in the 40s, as I recall.
Oh yeah, he was a deputy for a long time.
He must have been, yeah.
Yeah.
When did he start, do you know?
No, I don't have any idea, but he was there in 1921 anyway, when this case happened. Does anybody else know?
There's a picture of a church down the bottom of
with the boards back there. Where is that church?
That was that church at Albion. It was up on the hill. It wasn't down in the flat,
Okay, that's not,
up where the eucalyptus trees are. And don't ask me what happened to it, because I don't really know. Those two pictures of the Albion church are courtesy of Edith Wolfe. And Dr. Wolfe was a doctor at Albion for quite a few years, and Edith was his wife and his nurse. And he eventually went to work at the Redwood Coast Hospital in Fort Bragg, and they lived next door to my sister. So all kinds of interesting things from the Wolfes. Dr. Wolfe, when World War came along, Dr. Wolfe enlisted. He couldn't stand to be left out of World War I. And went and was a first lieutenant. Okay, we have one more family to talk about. If you've got, how much, have we talked our way out of this? Huh?
You gotta finish that third one. You can't go in there like that. Just cut out of this.
It's only an hour. Go ahead.
It's only an hour. Okay, well, I don't want to drive everybody mad. We have so many stories we could tell that we don't. Now, Patrick Alexander Stenberg is my father-in-law. And he came to the United States in 1905, and his first stop on the way across the country, because he came from Sweden. And before that, he'd been in the Swedish Navy. He spent a winter in the ice off Greenland, and had a lot of interesting things happen to him before he ever came to the United States. But on his way across the country, they stopped in Dover, Delaware, and worked there for a little while. And when he was in Dover, Delaware, he left the Lutheran church and became a Baptist. Okay. They went to he and his friends went to San Francisco, and they got there just after the earthquake in 1906, and they helped to tear down the city hall. When they ran out of work there, they came up the coast to Fort Bragg. And there, of course, because he'd become a Baptist, he joined the First Baptist Church. And he was active in the young people's program there, and as long as he lived, he was active in that church. So, but one of his jobs was he got a job at Cleone in a store. And up there they taught him about snipe hunting. I'm afraid that my father-in-law was a little like Jim Kerr. He wanted to be an entrepreneur, but he never was really terribly successful at it. He and Reverend W.A. Chapman had lots of threats. He was not only a businessman, but he was an undertaker and he was a preacher. So he had all kinds of opportunities going for him. They were in a second-hand store business. And Mike has the sign from the second-hand store. Maybe he'd like to tell you about how we happened to get that sign from the second-hand store.
Well, years ago, the Masonic Hall in Fort Bragg was remodeled, and the building had been basically condemned, and the only way to save it was they had to take the top story, the second story off the building there in Fort Bragg. And so today it only is a single-story building, but years ago it was a two-story building, and in this remodeling process, you know, they're cutting and tearing away the top story, and here's this piece of metal just used as a flashing, and the guy goes through it with a saw, and they rip it off there, and it's a sign on the back side, and you can see what it says. It says, Chapman and Stenberg used goods. We buy and sell anything Fort Bragg. And the contractor for the job was Harold Matson, and he knew my dad real well, and he saw that and said, they nailed it to that board and gave it to my dad.
Yeah. So we have solid evidence of the fact that we have to introduce another member of our family. Alex, you didn't get introduced, so stand up and get introduced. Alex has sat through the whole thing. This is Alex Gibney. He's my grandson. And this is Alana Stenberg, and she's my granddaughter, and she's Mike's daughter. Oh, we're really happy to have both of them here with us today. So, and now I have to think where I was.
Alex Lee's Fort Bragg.
What?
Alex Lee's Fort Bragg.
Okay, well, yeah,
Yeah, you
okay.
changed it.
He went, during the war, during World War I, the lumber business went in 1914 because they couldn't ship overseas. And so the lumber, there weren't any jobs were hard to find in Fort Bragg, so in 1915, Alex went to the Bay Area, and he had brothers down there, so they, so he got a job with Standard Oil in Richmond, and he worked there, and in that time he met a nice young lady, Ruth Winland, and in 1916 they got married, and so they were living in El Cerrito, and in those days El Cerrito was called Rusk, R-U-S-K, and her family lived in El Cerrito, and so it was a very friendly business. There was another place they went into business. He and his two brothers went into the business of an ice cream parlor on San Pablo Avenue. That didn't pan out either. They went broke there, and all we have left are some spoons that are over there, you know, the long spoons. So they worked, Patty worked at, and when my husband went in the Army, he had always been called Alex, and he hated being called Alex. So when he went in the Army, he called himself Pat, and he says, from now on, I'm Pat. And so you can tell whether people knew him before he went in the Army or after they went in the Army by what he called him. I called him Pat. And because his father had been called Pat, he had to change his name when it came up. So we always called his father Patty. So anyway, so I slip her once in a while. So Patty, now I lost it. I've talked too much.
You're doing good.
Tell me where I am.
Well, how about when they came to Fort Bragg?
Oh, yeah. When they came to Fort Bragg, they could have done
1921.
1921. The work was gone. He was laid off at the Standard Oil plant, and so he came back to Fort Bragg looking for a job, and he found one, and so they decided that they'd move up here. And by this time, there's Alex and Ruth and Patty. So they hired a couple of Swedes to drive their property up here. And those two Swedes, I don't know whether they were drunk or stupid,
Maybe both.
but they had a dog with them. And they were driving on the Cloverdale grade, and the dog was barking frantically, and they didn't pay any attention. And finally, when they did pay attention, it turned out everything on the truck was destroyed. And they had lost, you know, Mom had lost not only their furniture, but she had a lot of cut glass that had been given her as wedding presents. And it was a real disaster for her. But she didn't know about it. She and Alex came up on the train, and when they got off the train, then Patty had to tell them that they had nothing. Pat said he could remember they had 2 cups and 2 clothespins. And the church gave him a rocking chair, and that was the extent of it. Patty had gotten a job as a bull cook out at Camp 23 on the for the Union Lumber Company, and so they lived in a tent cabin that summer. Then in the fall they moved to town, and eventually Patty bought a piece of property, and he divided it, and he sold the big house at the corner of Cedar and Harold. He sold the big house, but he kept a section of the property, and he built the East Side Grocery, and opened the East Side Grocery, and built a house for them behind the East Side Grocery. And he didn't do any better in the East Side Grocery than he did and he tried at least 3 or 4 times more, and it was not ever a great success. And in 1931, he was elected constable of the 10 Mile Township, and that was a much kinder thing. But Mr. Mendoza reminded me of one thing that I should tell you, and that is that Mom Stenberg, Ruth, was a pianist, and for years she gave piano lessons. And there are hundreds of young people around Fort Bragg, probably a lot of them dead now, who took lessons from Mom Stenberg. She was giving piano lessons. Okay, Mike has one story that he wants to tell. This is the last story. We saved this one for last. It's about Patty and something that he did with the Baraka class, the young men's class at Fort Bragg.
This is in 1913. The date is not on these papers, but it's headline in the Fort Bragg Advocate, and you have to realize, you know, people were always making mistakes. Steinberg goes free. First Baraka mock trial is a decided success. The social auditorium of the Baptist Church of Fort Bragg was the scene of an exciting and laughable Baraka mock trial Friday evening. Just about all the law books in Fort Bragg were stacked high upon the desks of the prosecuting and defending attorneys, respectfully C.R. Ware and Robert Eldridge prosecuting, and C.V. Starr and E.H. White defending, who argued the case of Alex Steinberg, charged with disturbing the peace in the Sequoia Theater by his hearty volumes of laughter, before Superior Court Judge Sam Poland. The various conflicting points of law contained within and without those numerous volumes were decided by the judge in the fewest of words, generally, judgment overruled. Now the plot, as was exposed by the witnesses, involved a conspiracy in which C.R. Weller, ably assisted by H.G. Johnson, because of a petty grievance, induced Alex to go to the pictures with him, got him laughing heartily, and had his chair kicked out from under him, thusly causing a disturbance and his arrest. Bailiff Ender's task of securing jurors was of no small caliber. Among the various questions asked, Miss Hazel Taylor was forced to give her age. R.C. Green now was asked if he could read and write. Austin Taylor was asked if he was capable of forming an opinion. And J.W. Matthews was asked if he had any objection to capital punishment. Now, Marshall Smith was the first witness put on the stand for the prosecution, and he stated that he was present at the Sequoia Theater on the night of the arrest, and that his attention was attracted by the falling of a chair and a loud outburst of hysterical laughter immediately preceding the arrest, further stating that the picture that was on the canvas was not of a humorous nature, and it being the scene of a graveyard. Now, H.G. Johnson was the next witness for the prosecution. The substance of his testimony tended to prove that Alex's disturbance was of a misdemeanor nature. On being questioned as to the nature of the picture, he first put things into a turmoil by stating that it showed a balloon ascension, but afterwards squared himself by adding that the graveyard occupied the foreground. Now, Simpson, the next witness for the same side, turned state's evidence and left his attorneys in a bad fix. Banks, Bean, and Hyman were in turn put on the stand by the defending attorneys. True to their colors, they were all found to be firm believers in the laugh and grow fat theory, and consequently did not censure Alex for his laughter. They testified that Johnson kicked the chair out from under Alex. Weller and Johnson's past lives were also shown up in true form, and among other things, the 2:30 Sunday morning stunt was exposed. 2:30 in the morning to go to the pictures. And you thought we were bad. When put on the stand, C.R. Weller tried to muddle things up a little more by testifying that he only knew a Pat Stenberg, Alex's nickname. After lengthy pleas by both sides, the case was turned over to the jury, who, after being out a sufficient length of time, returned being unable to reach a verdict. About this time, a bright idea struck Attorney Starr, who procured from the vast law volumes a clause stating that a misdemeanor charge could not be tried in the Superior Court, whereupon George Poland threw the case out of court. Now, we neglected to mention, however, that the lawyer's common warning to the witnesses was, remember your oath, and that Attorney Starr was fined 45 cents for contempt of court in the 7th degree. All in all, the trial was an immense success, and it is to be hoped that the Baracas will further develop this new feature in Fort Bragg.
Okay, you all know who C.V. Starr was? The same fund that's funding the Aqua Center at the,
AIG.
yeah, he was the.
They have
fund-
commercials on
yeah,
television?
Yeah, so, he was an entrepreneur too, but he was successful. Well, if you have any questions, fine. If you don't, we'd like you to look at our pictures because we've spent a lot of time to collect them. And don't feel bad if you want to read my mother's memory book and read what the other little people said to her. That's okay too. So.
Thank you.